Chapter 3, The Geopolitical Stage. In 2017, the celebrity gossip website Page 6 blew the whistle on what was probably intended to be a secret meeting in Long Island, New York. Emily Smith wrote, "The Democrats' great freshman hope, Senator Kamala Harris, is heading to the Hamptons to meet with Hillary Clinton's biggest backers." The California senator is being feted in Bridgehampton on Saturday at the home of MWWPR guru Michael Kempner, a staunch Clinton supporter who was one of her national finance co-chairs and a lead fundraiser for her 2008 bid for the presidency. He was also listed as one of the top bundlers for Barack Obama's 2012 re-election campaign, having raised $3 million. The article went on to describe others who were meeting behind the prosecutor-turned-politician. Guests there to greet Harris are expected to include Margaret Alexander, a member of Clinton's inner circle, Dennis Mihail, a Democratic donor who is the chairman of the Battery Park City Authority, even though he lives between a sprawling Westchester estate and an Upper East Side pad, designer Stephen Gambrell, and Democratic National Committee member Robert Zimmerman. Washington lobbyist Liz Robbins is also hosting a separate Hamptons lunch for Harris. A fight behind closed doors. An article further reporting on the events described Harris' connections to another Clinton backer, the Hungarian billionaire George Soros. Writing for The Observer, Michael Sinaido wrote, in 2011, Harris's former aide, Lenore Anderson, was hired as campaign manager for Californians for Safety and Justice, which was financed by Soros's Open Society Foundations. Since 2012, Soros had led a 4-year, $16 million campaign to change California criminal policy, which Harris was deeply involved in as California Attorney General. Lenore Anderson also led Vote Safe, another Soros-funded organization. With Clinton's continued attempts to test the waters for a 2020 run falling flat, Kamala Harris was the new pick of her top financial backers. Things look good for Kamala heading toward the 2020 Democratic primary. She was only a freshman senator, but she was a charismatic speaker and was making a name for herself grandstanding against Trump and interrogating his allies at televised congressional hearings. A definitive moment for Kamala's presidential campaign came on July 31, 2019, when Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard used her limited time to make a short speech exposing Harris's record as a prosecutor. This was an odd decision for Tulsi Gabbard to make. Gabbard was treated as a fringe candidate and received very limited time on the debate stage. Why use a few moments of national airtime to single out a single top-tier rival? Keep in mind that Kamala was not even among the top 2 frontrunners. Understanding Gabbard's motivation gets to the essence of understanding the danger posed by Kamala Harris. While serving in the House of Representatives, Tulsi Gabbard remained a member of the Army National Guard. She served a tour of duty in Iraq. Despite being a member of the military, Gabbard's campaign focused on her anti-war platform and her call to stop arming terrorists in Syria and engaging in regime change wars. Illustrating her platform, Gabbard explained, "We have spent trillions of dollars on regime change wars in the Middle East, while communities like Hawaii face a severe lack of affordable housing, aging infrastructure, the need to invest in education, healthcare, and so much more." Gabbard's website describes the landmark legislation she proposed, the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, H.R. 608, that would stop the U.S. government from using taxpayer dollars to directly or indirectly support groups who are allied with and supporting terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in their war to overthrow the Syrian government. The legislation is based on congressional action during the Iran-Contra affair to stop the CIA's illegal arming of rebels in Nicaragua. It is endorsed by Progressive Democrats for America, the U.S. Peace Council, and Veterans for Peace. Gabbard's presidential campaign was almost immediately attacked in the press, in addition to being often outright ignored. Hillary Clinton attempted to link Tulsi Gabbard to Russia, and in response, Gabbard filed a defamation lawsuit. The fact that Gabbard met with Syrian President Bashar Assad in a trip organized by the Christian-led Syrian Social Nationalist Party was also widely criticized. Though Gabbard's campaign was highly unsuccessful, her takedown of Kamala Harris knocked her out of the race. Tulsi's few sentences exposing Kamala and Kamala's lack of an effective rebuttal turned the tides. On the debate stage, Kamala could barely muster any response to Gabbard's very true exposition of her political record and obvious lack of moral compass. In a follow-up conversation with Anderson Cooper after the debate on CNN, Harris was once again given an opportunity to rebut Gabbard's remarks. All she could muster was to bait Gabbard for her alleged sympathies for the Syrian government. Following the July 31st debate, Harris began to sink in the polls. Harris' agitational style, cascading Trump with a pointed finger and invoking the racism and hardship of her childhood, was certainly charming at first. However, millions of Americans were led by Tulsi Gabbard to see Kamala Harris not simply as a person who would use her oral skills to prosecute Donald Trump, but as someone who would happily use it against their innocent fathers, brothers, sons, and daughters without remorse, in the hopes of simply advancing her career. Kamala no longer seemed bold, but rather quite frightening. The public rejected Kamala Harris at the polls. Bernie Sanders, attacked by the media for his alleged ties to Cuba, much like Karen Bass would later be attacked, did far better among the voters. However, the selection of her as VP nominee, with Joe Biden's frail, elderly condition, has her once again on the fast track to head of state, despite the American people's better judgment. So why did Gabbard utilize her limited time on the debate stage to target a single candidate? Furthermore, why was a member of the Army National Guard running on an anti-war platform? This also leads us back to the opening questions about why Harris's nomination for vice president was so last-minute and surrounded by so much confusion. The reality is that a fight is taking place at the top of U.S. society, mostly behind closed doors. The fight goes on across party lines, within intelligence agencies, and inside the so-called deep state apparatus, and within the financial business elite. Essentially, forces from many different angles are trying to hold off the destructive agenda of one very dangerous and powerful clique. The Honduran Coup of 2009. Hillary Clinton ran the U.S. State Department from 2009 to 2013. It is doubtful that any individual U.S. official has ever done so much damage to the global community in such a short time. Clinton was backed by the same forces that now financially back Kamala Harris. She had a slew of staffers including Jared Cohen, Samantha Power, Anne Marie Slaughter, and Susan Rice. On the 28th of June, 2009, the Honduran military toppled the elected government. Manuel Zelaya, who won the election fair and square according to every poll and observer, was overthrown. In her book, Hard Choices, Clinton claims he was removed due to fears that he was preparing to circumvent the Constitution and extend his term in office. This is false. Zelaya had been in the process of taking a non-binding poll among the Honduran public about whether or not they would favor the ratification of a new constitution. In Venezuela and Bolivia, the Bolivarian governments had ratified a new constitution to move the country towards socialism. Zelaya simply wanted to see if there was a popular mandate for doing so in Honduras before proposing it to the legislators. The military, trained and armed by the U.S. government, was determined to make sure that did not happen. Manuel Zelaya was kidnapped at gunpoint by the military and flown out of the country in his pajamas. A military junta assumed power. The results of this coup in Honduras have been horrendous. In 2009, Honduras already had the highest homicide rate in the world due to the prevalence of drug cartels among the impoverished population. From 2008 to 2011, the murder rate had increased in Honduras by 50%. The U.S.-backed free market regime had not only presided over extreme poverty in Honduras, but it has maintained power through political assassinations. LGBT activists in particular have been targeted by right-wing kill squads aligned with the drug gangs. Immediately following the coup, U.S. President Obama told the press that the moves by the Honduras military had been not legal. However, Hillary Clinton's State Department had been heavily involved in the coup long before it happened. Jake Johnstone wrote an article for The Intercept published on August 29, 2017, describing how top leaders of the Honduran military had been taking classes with the U.S. Department of Defense. The coup plotters were all well connected to the U.S. military brass and friendly with members of Congress. While Barack Obama appears to have learned of the Honduran coup when it occurred, Hillary Clinton had been tipped off by Hugo Lawrence, U.S. ambassador to Honduras a week before. The U.S. State Department had then dispatched John D. Negroponte to meet with the coup plotters. Negroponte had a history of ties to political violence in Central America, going back to the Contra War in Nicaragua during the 1980s. He had also been involved with the Battalion 316 that had murdered 200 people in Honduras. After the coup, as the wave of assassinations of political descendants began, Hillary Clinton's State Department showered funds on the propaganda campaign for the new regime. In 2012, as Honduras descended into social and political chaos in the wake of the U.S.-sanctioned military coup, the civilian aid arm of Hillary Clinton's State Department spent over $26 million on a propaganda program aimed at encouraging anti-violence alliances between Honduran community groups and local police and security forces, writes Tom Shorrock for The Nation on April 5, 2016. The program, called Honduras Convive, was designed by the U.S. Agency for International Development to reduce violent crimes in a country that had simultaneously become the murder capital of the world and a staging ground for one of the largest deployments of U.S. Special Operations Forces outside of the Middle East. A total of roughly $57 million in aid was provided to the Honduran government by the U.S. State Department from 2009 to 2014. According to the CIA World Facebook, over 12%, well over 1 in 10 Hondurans cannot read or write. The infant mortality rate is a whopping 14.6 deaths for every 1,000 live births. As drug violence persists and access to running water and electricity remains unavailable to large chunks of the population, many of the thousands of refugees found at the U.S. border are Hondurans. The body count of Hillary Clinton's State Department in Honduras is most likely in the hundreds of thousands. Hillary Clinton enabled the violent overthrow of a democratically elected government and then proceeded to throw money at the death squad regime. The 2009 coup and the continued propping up of this regime with U.S. military personnel and funding which she launched and to which Obama may have at first been oblivious had resulted in continued instability in this small country of just 9 million people south of the U.S. border. Malnutrition, lack of access to health care, lack of access to clean drinking water, drug gang violence, and political repression have taken a tremendous humanitarian toll. The violence has spilled over into Mexico and other parts of the region. It has contributed to the overall decline of living standards in the region. The Arab Spring. The Arab Spring events of 2011 were not spontaneous. They were said to begin when Tunisian fruit seller Mohamed Bouazizi lit himself on fire in December of 2010. However, suicides, even theatrical ones, often go unnoticed. In Muslim countries, the press makes a bigger point of not highlighting suicides for religious reasons. The reason that Bouazizi's recorded self-immolation sparked a series of events was not simply because it happened, but because it went viral. Videos of the flames and the small local uprisings shot across Facebook and Twitter. Al Jazeera, the TV network owned by the U.S.-backed autocracy in Qatar, highlighted the events as well. In 2016, it was confirmed what had long been suspected. The Wall Street Journal reported, Facebook Incorporated exerts more editorial control than it previously disclosed over the trending news feature on the social network. Newly posted documents show. News stories do not go viral randomly based on how many clicks and likes they get. Rather, a select group of news curators who are not immune from political bias carefully manipulate the algorithms, deciding what stories show up on individual news feeds. From Wall Street Journal, May 12, 2016. In her State Department, Hillary Clinton had selected Jared Andrew Cohen to direct social media operations. Cohen is a Rhodes Scholar and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is currently the CEO of Jigsaw, the corporation previously known as Google Ideas. Long before Clinton had worked at the State Department, Jared Cohen had participated in Clinton's policy planning staff from 2006 to 2010. In 2009, Jared Cohen contacted Twitter, asking them to help facilitate protests against the Iranian government in the hopes of destabilizing the government and overthrowing the Ayatollahs. In doing so, he went directly against the wishes and policies of the White House. An article published in The New Yorker on April 25, 2011, cites an unnamed official reporting that Cohen almost lost his job over it. If it had been up to the White House, they would have fired him. Cohen took the move in direct disobedience to Obama, but in full obedience to Hillary Clinton. The article states, Clinton did not betray any disagreement with the president over Iran policy, but in an interview with me, she cited Cohen's action with pride. Anne-Marie Slaughter, an academic who was essential in the Hillary Clinton State Department, loves the fact that Clinton took office intent on spreading unrest across the planet. Secretary Clinton can push the agenda she pushes because she is tough, and people know she is tough. Anne-Marie Slaughter is heavily influenced by Zbigniew Brzezinski. She speaks of a new form of governance through global networks. Her books with titles such as A New World Order and The Chessboard and the Web talk of destabilizing and overthrowing governments, paving the way for open governments, open societies, and an open international system. The Middle East was a ticking time bomb in 2010. Mass unemployment in the urban centers due to the financial crisis and massive drought affecting the rural population all saw unrest on the horizon. The Hillary Clinton State Department decided to take a match to the tinderbox with members of the 1979 revolution in Iran or the rise of Ba'athist Arab socialism in their minds. Fearing uncontrolled unrest and the rise of anti-imperialist forces, the Hillary Clinton State Department preempted any explosion or organic resistance with a controlled demolition. The fact that America's first African-American president, a man with a Muslim middle name who had attended an Islamic elementary school, sat at the presidency was key in making the magic happen. Rather than pouring into the streets to chant "Death to America," the confused crowds could be covertly directed by social media and Qatari state media. The Muslim Brotherhood, a longtime soft power proxy of U.S. power in Egypt, Syria, and other countries throughout the region, would be the most influential force in manipulating events. The Muslim Brotherhood had been utilized by the CIA to work against Arab socialist leader Gamal Abdul Nasser in Egypt during the 1950s. In the 1980s, leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood had staged a violent uprising against the Syrian Arab Republic, supported by the United States in their efforts to topple Ba'athist Arab socialism. Israel had even covertly supported the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s in order to divide Palestinian resistance. A Wall Street Journal article from January 24, 2009, quotes Avner Cohen, a former religious affairs official in Israel, as saying, "Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation." Avner has been very public about the fact that he and other Israeli officials covertly supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine in its efforts to attack Marxist Palestinian organizations like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Eventually, from the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine emerged Hamas. The Muslim Brotherhood significantly gained from the Arab Spring. In Egypt, Mohamed Morsi was elected president. In Tunisia, the Muslim Brotherhood gained a huge increase in political influence. Of course, amid such events, all kinds of forces poured into the streets. Iran hailed an Islamic awakening, helping to push the protesters towards Shia Islam and its tradition of resistance to oppression. Communists also joined the protests in Egypt and elsewhere. However, the news curators of social media and the producer of CNN arranged for the world to look the other way as Saudi Arabia invaded Bahrain to prop up the autocratic monarchy and slaughtered the Shia majority, who protested for their human rights. The Yemeni People's Revolutionary Uprisings, which set the stage for the eventual seizure of power by Ansarullah and the Revolutionary Committee in 2015, was also ignored. Amid the chaos, Hillary Clinton's State Department worked to specifically target two anti-imperialist socialist states. The first target was Libya. Until 2011, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the entire African continent. The country had universal housing and literacy. Gaddafi had constructed a great man-made river the largest irrigation system in the world. Libya was leading talks of creating an independent African currency. In order to topple the most prosperous government in Africa, the U.S. State Department facilitated a flow of religious fanatics in Libya. Among them was Salman Ramadan Abedi, who would return to his home country of Britain and bomb the Manchester Arena, killing 23 people. What Hillary Clinton and her allies claimed was a glorious revolution was a bloodbath of religious fanaticism and racism. The New York Times was forced to reveal that the fact that anti-Gaddafi Libyans were lynching dark-skinned guest workers with a headline from September 5, 2011, reading, "Libyans turn wrath on dark-skinned migrants." As social media rallied instability in Libya, social media conveniently agitated the public with slogans like, "Gaddafi is killing us with his Africans." Clinton protege Susan Rice told the press that Gaddafi was distributing Viagra in order to encourage his soldiers to engage in mass rape. Amnesty International later debunked his claim. The results of overthrowing the Islamic Socialist government of Libya have been disastrous. Conditions have become so bad in Libya since it has joined Anne-Marie Slaughter's open international system that people are packing into boats by the thousands to flee. Since 2013, over 700 Libyans have crossed the Mediterranean into Europe on boats. Hundreds have died in numerous instances where these ships have sunk. In 2017, the world was shocked to discover the existence of open-air slave markets in Libyan cities. Much of the country remains without electricity. Instability persists as different factions battle for power. Jihadist groups had significantly increased their presence in the region, and much of the instability in Mali and other countries has been linked to the toppling of the Libyan government. Videos surfaced of Hillary Clinton being informed about the death of the socialist leader who raised millions from poverty in Libya, much like the way Kamala Harris cackled with delight about imprisoning the parents of low-income children. Clinton giggles and proclaims, "We came, we saw, he died." The Syrian Arab Republic, a holdout of Ba'athist Arab socialism, was also targeted. The life expectancy in Syria increased by 17 years from 1970 to 2009 due to the huge efforts of the socialist government to provide medical care and train doctors. Infant mortality dropped dramatically from 132 deaths per 1,000 live births to only 17.9 during the period, according to the Avicenna Journal of Medicine. The U.S. Library of Congress Country Study of Syria, published in 1987, described huge achievements in the field of education conducted by the Ba'ath Socialist State. During the 1980s, for the first time in Syria's history, the country achieved full primary school enrollment of males. At the time the study was published, 85% of females also enrolled in primary school. In 1981, 42% of Syria's adult population was illiterate, but by 1991, illiteracy had been wiped out. The Soviet Union had cooperated with the Syrian government to engage in big construction projects, including the Takba Dam on the Euphrates River, which enabled irrigation of the countryside and provided hydroelectric power to the population. In more recent decades, China had increased its cooperation with the Ba'ath Socialists. In 2007, the Jamestown Foundation reported that China had invested in hundreds of millions of dollars in Syria in efforts to modernize the country's aging oil and gas infrastructure. But Hillary Clinton and her wrecking crew moved in to destroy it. The Syrian Arab Republic had already been labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism due to its arming of the Palestinians. The fact that it had turned down the proposal to build an oil pipeline with the U.S.-aligned autocracies of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but instead was working to build one with the Islamic Republic of Iran, was almost likely a factor driving the destruction of a previously peaceful Arab country. The Syrian government attempted to accommodate the concerns of the protesters who took to the streets in 2011, ratifying a new constitution. Because many of the protesters were Sunni Muslims influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood and Saudi Arabia to oppose Bashar Assad as a Shia apostate for his Alawite religious background. the new constitution specifically honored Sunni Islam. Assad began praying in Sunni mosques and engaged in other activities that are not done by Alawites in order to show solidarity with the Sunni majority. The USA began arming and training extremists to tear down the Syrian Arab Republic almost immediately after the 2011 Arab Spring protests. In 2013, the BBC published a guide to Syrian rebels. Listed among them was not only the infamous Islamic State organization, but also the Nusra Front, previously known as Al-Qaeda in Syria. Other organizations with names like the Islamic Front, the Islamic Liberation Front, and the Afad al-Razul brigades were also listed. While U.S. media Al Jazeera, Twitter, and Facebook dazzled Western audiences with the stories of revolutionaries fighting for human rights against a dictator, the reality is that the anti-Assad coalition was primarily concerned about ending religious freedom and establishing a Saudi-style Wahhabi autocracy. Early on in the fighting, UN official Carly Del Ponte confirmed that the U.S.-backed terrorists in Syria were utilizing chemical weapons in their fight against the government. Child soldiers made up a significant percentage of the anti-government fighting force. Homeless children and orphans throughout the region were being shipped to Syria, indoctrinated into the Saudi brand of Islamic extremism, and sent to die in the fight to overthrow Ba'athist Arab socialism. The humanitarian costs of the conflict in Syria, which the Hillary Clinton State Department engineered, has been well over 500,000 lives. Millions of Syrians have become refugees. The Syrian government remains intact, despite relentless efforts to overthrow it. Russia and Iran have offered significant support to the Syrian government. Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon were decisive in defeating the ISIS terrorists who emerged from within the U.S.-backed anti-Assad coalition. Qasem Soleimani, who Donald Trump assassinated with a drone on January 3, 2020, was key in fighting to protect Christians and religious minorities from U.S.-backed fanatics in Syria as a leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. Conflict within the deep state. In April of 2016, when asked about his biggest regret about his presidency in a Fox News interview, Barack Obama said, "Probably failing to plan for the day after what I think was the right thing to do in intervening in Libya." Later in the interview, Obama stated that the intervention did not work. Furthermore, in May of 2017, Obama described his decision to not attack Syria with cruise missiles in 2013 as his most courageous decision as president. What is interesting about both of these moments is that Hillary Clinton and her State Department were heavily involved. In 2011, Hillary Clinton, Samantha Power pushed very hard for Obama to intervene in Libya. Obama did so and regrets the results and the matter of the intervention. In 2013, Hillary Clinton also pushed for Obama to directly attack the Syrian Arab Republic in response to the allegations about chemical weapons. Obama did not do so and considered this a great moment. This reveals at what was also hinted at when Obama attempted to fire Jared Cohen over his meddling in Iran via Twitter. The Obama administration was at odds with the Hillary Clinton State Department. Barack Obama replaced Hillary Clinton with John Kerry as Secretary of State in his second term. John Kerry focused not on spreading revolution and destabilizing countries, but rather on establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba and negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. Kerry's State Department seemed not to clash with the White House to any significant degree. But the Obama White House was not the only faction within the U.S. government apparatus that seemed to realize how dangerous the action of Hillary Clinton's State Department really were. Amid the 2013 crisis, when it appeared Obama was on the brink of launching cruise missiles against the Syrian government, many rank-and-file soldiers expressed disgust on social media. On September 1, 2013, mainstream outlet Business Insider observed, As the march to limited military intervention in Syria moves forward, some troops are making their views known a bit anonymously on social media. Photos of service members have apparently popped up on Reddit, seemingly in protest of Syrian intervention. The basic argument is that the line between moderate rebel factions and al-Qaeda-affiliated ones are somewhat murky in the 2-year-old civil war, so the U.S. should stay away. Indeed, many within the U.S. intelligence agencies, military brass, and State Department learn to speak and read Arabic in order to do their jobs. It is likely that many of those who are motivated by a desire to defeat terrorism and protect American civilians from another 9/11 were horrified to discover that the U.S. government was actively arming the entities that would eventually establish an Islamic State. In Syria, just like Afghanistan during the 1980s, or in Libya during the 2011 revolution, the U.S. government was not opposing the terrorists. The USA was helping and arming the terrorists in the hopes of destabilizing a socialist state. So understanding that many within the Pentagon realized the harsh realities of what was done by the Hillary Clinton State Department, it should not be surprising that an Army National Guard soldier became the primary congressional voice in opposition to destabilizing Syria by arming terrorists. Tulsi Gabbard represents a whole layer of people within the Pentagon who are disillusioned with the humanitarian intervention, regime change, foreign policy of the United States. Pentagon figures like retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who went on to briefly serve as National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, made similar statements. It should not be surprising that during her presidential campaign, Gabbard used her limited time to verbally take down the newly selected candidate of the faction behind Hillary Clinton's State Department. The specific group of wealthy donors that Kamala Harris met with in the Hamptons, who had put their money behind Hillary Clinton, made a group decision to pick Kamala Harris as their new great hope in 2017. Her personality profile and career history seemed to match what they were looking for. The forces that seek to create an open society at the cost of unlimited human lives have lined up behind Kamala Harris. The utopian bloodlust of the revolutionary intelligentsia has been hijacked to serve imperialism. The permanent revolution the Soviet people rejected is now being taken up by Western intelligence agencies. It is no longer intended to empower the proletariat, but to unleash the impulses of millions and tear apart the authoritarianism of civilization which restrains capitalist greed. It shouldn't be surprising that Joe Biden, who sided with the White House against Hillary Clinton's State Department, would be reluctant to add Kamala Harris to the 2020 ticket. It is not surprising that he would delay the decision as long as possible and scour the party for any possible alternative. It fits the narrative that as Karen Bass appeared from nowhere in the eyes of the media as suddenly being a potential VP pick, a dossier of information about her alleged ties to the Cuban government suddenly found its way to the front pages. Who keeps track of Cuba's contacts in the United States and monitors who travels to the socialist island? Who complied with such information on Karen Bass and kept it on file in case she was ever to gain significant traction? Many people behind the scenes know who is behind Kamala Harris. They know how many millions of lives were needlessly destroyed by the Hillary Clinton State Department. They know how terrorist groups expanded, a refugee crisis was created, and global instability persists long after the demented experiment of social media and revolution concluded in 2013. The fact that Trump made statements on the campaign trail about how Hillary Clinton literally created ISIS was no accident. The facts described in this text may not appear on CNN, but they are well known to numerous people within many layers of what has now been labeled the deep state. Somehow, Kamala Harris overcame her many opponents. Her faction was able to maneuver its way to secure her position as vice president. Despite Biden's reluctance and the voters' lack of interest in this supposed rock star freshman senator, when Kamala Harris accepted a nomination on August 19th at the Democratic National Convention, her remarks and the video that preceded them were predictable. Kamala mentioned her father in passing, but eulogized her mother in glowing terms. When talking about her accomplishments as a prosecutor, Kamala Harris declared, "I fought for children and survivors of sexual assault. I fought against transnational gangs. I took on the biggest banks and helped take down one of the biggest for-profit colleges. I know a predator when I see one." The sentence, "I know a predator when I see one," was followed by an awkward pause. Meanwhile, after Harris was announced, many media outlets and Trump supporters had been highlighting the fact that on April 2nd, 2018, Kamala Harris stated she believed four of the women who accused Joe Biden of sexual assault. Harris said, "I believe them, and I respect them being able to tell their story and having the courage to do it." No retraction of her statement was ever given. The line from Kamala's acceptance speech seemed to be an affirmation that her assessment of Joe Biden had been correct. If indeed she knows a predator when she sees one, she would have been correct in believing his accusers. Most interpret the comment as merely a reference to the widespread allegations that Donald Trump sexually assaulted women, but such a statement at the Democratic National Convention would not be coded or followed by an awkward pause. One wonders what heated exchanges took behind closed doors in the lead-up to Joe Biden's announcement that Kamala was his VP pick. The fact that Kamala's name appeared separate from the VP nominee on the Democratic Convention speaker's schedule, published just shortly before the announcement, or that Kamala's Twitter account unfollowed Joe Biden just a few hours before, is also very telling. It seems Joe Biden did not want to nominate the woman who invoked his ties to segregationists and was backed by the same forces that spawned the Hillary Clinton State Department, an entity which he, Obama, tried to contain. Something changed Joe Biden's mind right before finally announcing his selected running mate. The decision came a full 10 days after the deadline Biden had given himself. The Specter of Populism. Karl Marx began the Communist Manifesto in 1848 with the catchy line, "A specter is haunting Europe. It is the specter of communism." It has been noted, too, that the first English translation hilariously began with the words, "A frightful hobgoblin is haunting Europe." However, what was Marx alluding to with his opening line? He was alluding to the fact that despite the fact that no real organized revolutionary movement of the proletariat existed, the atmosphere was charged with the realization that such a force was imminent. It was only a matter of time before the factory workers, who were being driven to work harder and harder for lower and lower pay, organized themselves not simply to fight for better conditions, but to seize control of the state and the major commanding heights of economic power. Long before Marx uttered the words dictatorship of the proletariat, the capitalists, independent observers, and many others had assumed it was only a matter of time before a movement demanding such a thing existed. The specter was also indeed haunting Europe, and the Communist Manifesto was written because it is high time the communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. A similar situation existed in the aftermath of 2008 to 2009 financial crisis. Headlines such as "We're all socialists now" and talk of Karl Marx came from the bourgeoisie itself. They understood that the circumstances would most likely give rise to a revived opposition to the profit-based economic system, and interest in Marxism would grow. Before such sentiments emerged from the masses, it seemed warnings of it were pouring out of the pages of the New York Times. There has certainly been an expansion of nominally socialist groups and left-wing activism in the United States since 2008. Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the wave of support for Bernie Sanders among young liberals certainly represents a political shift. However, This political shift was weakened by the very corruption of leftist politics that gave birth to Kamala Harris. Decades and decades of covert funding and manipulation has significantly exaggerated the tendencies of the revolutionary intelligentsia. Efforts that began as an attempt to create a gap between Western radicals and existing socialism have completely reinvented the definition of Marxism. The absence of class struggle politics and the obsession with individualism and identity politics rendered the left quite ineffective in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Anti-populism, identity politics, oppression theory, and an obsession with the unleashing of sexual impulses and rage has rendered the socialist movement far more than ineffective. Instead of being a vehicle for the working class to seize power and reinvent society, the various manifestations of leftism that currently exist, be they social democracy, anarchism, Trotskyism, or whatnot, have become a vehicle for destabilizing anti-imperialist states. They more effectively secure the rule of the big corporations across the planet. Wherever Wall Street is looking to topple any anti-imperialist state, the protests against it, cheered by U.S. media, inevitably involve teenagers in Che Guevara t-shirts and Guy Fawkes masks. The forces of free market capitalism can always depend on a movement that has been reduced to an expression of adolescent rebellion being manipulated in their service. The internet is filled with young, confused radicals pouring out hatred against their parents, their teachers, and various public figures for allegedly being racist, sexist, or transphobic. New forms of oppression to be tweeted against, such as fat phobia and smoker phobia, seem to be invented each day. The latest social crime of some celebrity seems to be constantly trending. To them, China, the Soviet Union, Venezuela, and other anti-imperialist and socialist states are all fascist. The only supposed revolutionary movement in the world they can bring themselves to support is the Kurdish YPG, which is also being openly supported by the CIA. In the absence of the populist rhetoric that made William Z. Foster, Eugene Debs, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and Huey Newton into effective mass organizers, the right wing has hijacked the populist ethos. Many wrote of Trump transforming the Republican Party into a party of the working class. Trump's inaugural address opened with these interesting few paragraphs. For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across our land. That all changes, starting right here and right now, because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you. The snake. However, the Trump administration has acted completely contrary to the sentiments behind these words. Rather than fighting for those deprived of wealth in this country, Trump has lifted taxes and regulations on the most wealthy. Rather than ending wars, he has escalated international tensions, murdered a top Iranian general, bombed Syria as Obama refused to do, and attempted to stage a violent military coup in Venezuela. Rather than address the concerns about liberty being restricted, the White House has escalated the police state. Federal officers have been sent to Portland to grab protesters off of the street. At a moment when police brutality and the devaluing of African American life has been widely recognized, Trump has positioned himself as a defender of the police. He has argued that the police are too restrained in their violence against protesters and favors an escalation of brutality and repression. Trump takes his opportunity to accuse his detractors of being communist and defends a system which puts profits over people as being inherently American. Trump often presents himself as being rich, tough, and unconcerned about the needs of other people. The problematic aspects of Kamala Harris's psyche, her desire to harm others and indifference to the results of her actions, manifests itself in Trump most certainly. However, Trump expresses his destructive impulses in a different way. In much of Trump's rhetoric, one finds a disturbing theme of celebrating the dark phenomenon, often described as man's inhumanity to man, or in other cases, merely as a selfish indifference to the suffering of others. On the campaign trail in 2016, as Trump demonized immigrant workers, he recited the lyrics to 1960s soul musician Oscar Brown Jr.'s song, The Snake. The song was made popular by Al Wilson. The lyrics told of a woman who mistakenly takes compassion on an injured snake, and after taking it home and caring for it, is bitten by it. The lyrics recited by Trump goes as follows. On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor half-frozen snake. His pretty colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. "Oh, well," she cried, "I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you." "Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, oh tender woman," sighed the snake. She wrapped him all cozy in a curvature of silk, and then laid him by the fireside with some honey and some milk. Now she hurried home from work that night. As soon as she arrived, she'd found the pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. "Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, oh tender woman," sighed the snake. She now clutched him to her bosom. "You're so beautiful," she cried. "But if I hadn't brought you in by now, you might have died." Now she stroked his pretty skin, and then kissed and held him tight. But instead of saying thanks, the snake gave her a vicious bite. "Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, oh tender woman," sighed the snake. "I saved you," cried that woman. "And you've bite me even. Why?" "You know your bite is poisonous, and now I'm going to die." "Oh, shut up, silly woman," said the reptile with a grin. "You knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in." The implication of Trump's recitation of the snake are that immigrant workers pose a danger and that our compassion for them is naive and potentially self-destructive. However, the implications of the poem go further. The poem implies that compassion itself is foolish and weak. Humans should not be suckers who want to help the downtrodden, but instead should simply pursue their own self-interest. Not surprisingly, many of Trump's supporters have studied the writings of the objectivist Ayn Rand, who spoke of capitalism as an unknown ideal of a world without a government where all human solidarity has been broken down and the virtue of selfishness prevails. Many of his supporters see Trump not as a defender of the common people, but as a non-conforming, selfish billionaire, much like Ayn Rand's fictional John Galt. Trump most likely sees himself as a powerful Übermensch, not concerned about the impact of his actions on inferior, lesser beings. Education for death. There is a fascistic edge to this kind of libertarian rhetoric, though it flows directly from the Western liberal ideal that celebrates individualism above all else. One is forced to think of a depiction of the education of children in Nazi Germany widely circulated during the Second World War in the cartoon short film entitled Education for Death from Walt Disney Productions. The 11-minute film, created in 1943, features one scene in which a Nazi schoolteacher tells a class of students about a wolf chasing down and devouring a rabbit. Now let's see what they will learn from this little lesson, asks the narrator. A child meekly answers in German, with the teacher giving an angry response. The narrator continues, explaining why the child's response was met with hostility. He said, "The poor rabbit! Is he out of his mind?" What would the Führer think of such an answer? What would Herr Göring think, and Herr Goebbels? Now then, who can give the correct answer? The teacher continues, turning to the rest of the students. One boy immediately speaks up, proclaiming, "The world belongs to the strong and to the brutal." Another chimes in, "The rabbit is a coward and deserves to die. I spit on the rabbit," another student adds. The teacher then turns to the original child who first spoke with empathy for the devoured creature. Suddenly, the child speaks up, now learning to kill the empathy and basic human instincts of compassion within him. Stuttering out the party line, the narrator explains, "He hates the rabbit. There's no room for weaklings. Little Hans is learning fast. My, how he hates the rabbit." Hans has come around to the correct Nazi way of thinking, the teacher announces. The narrator continues, "Yes, this lesson is the basis for the Nazi creed. Germany will likewise destroy all weak and cowardly nations." The class of students begin giving the Nazi salute to their teacher, chanting, "Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil." While the modern right-wing attempts to claim that Nazism is a left-wing ideology and laughs off the accusation of fascism hurled at them, they cannot avoid the simple moral question. Fascism is based on a concept of might makes right and seeks to eliminate the human side of human beings, reducing them to the mentality of predatory beasts. In his review of Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, even the anti-communist McCarthyist stool pigeon Whittaker Chambers could not conceal his revulsion. Writing for National Review, Chambers described Ayn Rand's text this way: "From almost any page of Atlas Shrugged, a voice can be heard from painful necessity, commanding, 'To the gas chamber, go!'" While the Nazis invoked a notion of solidarity and brotherhood among Germans, and referred to themselves as National Socialists like Benito Mussolini in Italy. They were covertly backed by British intelligence in their struggle for power against the communist revolutionaries. Social Darwinism, eugenics, survival of the fittest, might makes right, and other such concepts were developed and promoted to justify the economic theories of Adam Smith. Nazi ideology was an incarnation of British imperial ideals, not the rich history of German culture. Free market capitalism, most especially in its monopoly stage of imperialism, identified by Vladimir Lenin in his groundbreaking text, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, actively cultivates selfishness, lack of empathy, and the predatory primitive instincts of mankind. Long before any socialist state existed, free market capitalism conducted a series of man-made famines in which millions were needlessly starved. In India, Ireland, Iran, the Arab world, Africa, and Asia, the British Empire snuffed out the lives of millions of people deemed to be racially inferior. At gunpoint, China was forced to allow British imports to destroy their domestic industries in 2 opium wars. Under the domination of British bankers, China experienced routine famines and malnutrition-related deaths. British settlers in Africa exterminated entire villages with the earliest machine guns. The brutality and inhumanity of the British Empire, conducted in the name of free trade and survival of the fittest, has been conveniently forgotten in the light of the 20th century. Historians ignore the massive body count of capitalism because it does not fit a political narrative about anti-totalitarianism. Nazism is largely an expression of this British capitalism and its supremacist philosophy that views the majority of humanity as useless eaters. Nazism is not the logical conclusion of German culture or civilization. Until the rise of the Nazi state, Germany was the global stronghold not only of Marxism, but also of art, science, music, and cinema. It was Germany that brought us the music of Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart. The cinema of the Weimar Republic, films such as Metropolis and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, are still widely viewed today and viewed as cutting-edge in artistic style, rivaling the achievements of Sergei Einstein and Soviet cinema during the same era. In the 1920s, Berlin was one of the few places on earth where tolerance for sexual minorities was being openly preached. The majority of Germans did not favor the Nazi Party. The British imperialists selected the Nazis to rule over Germany as part of the geopolitical game they were playing in the hopes of destroying the Soviet Union. Only after the Reichstag fire and the rounding up of communist members of parliament were the Nazis able to secure control of the legislature. Never did the German population elect a Nazi majority to the parliament. The German Communist Party had been the largest communist party in the world outside the USSR. The Social Democratic Party was equally large. Even after the Nazis took power, underground communist resistance persisted right up until the Red Army took Berlin. Ernst Thälmann was a hero to millions as he sat in the fascist prison, refusing to abandon his principles, even under torture. Today, the British and the Americans are trying to twist the arms of the German people and force them to cooperate in their efforts to weaken Russia's natural gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2. The Germans are expected to pay the excessive cost of importing natural gas from far-off countries rather than purchase it from their Russian neighbors. Much like the propping up of Nazism in order to defeat the German working class movement. The campaign against Nord Stream 2 is yet another crime of Wall Street and London in their relentless efforts for greater profits and world domination. Donald Trump, in his obsession with military strength and his hatred for the most vulnerable in U.S. society, and Kamala Harris, with her gleeful obsession with punishment and revenge, both incarnate different versions of the same disordered thinking. It should not be surprising that admirers of Ayn Rand can be found all across the U.S. political spectrum. Republicans Paul Ryan and Democrat Stacey Abrams have both described the demented text Atlas Shrugged as their favorite book. This philosophy that scoffs at love your neighbor as yourself and celebrates cruelty and lack of empathy is capitalism and liberalism taken to their logical conclusion. Single-minded son of the working class. We are forced once again to revisit Sigmund Freud and his attempt to interpret the sentiments in religion which others find satisfying. Freud writes of this oceanic feeling he cannot understand that a feeling can only be a source of energy if it is itself the expression of a strong need. The derivation of religious needs from the infant's helplessness and the longing for the father aroused by it seems to me to be incontrovertible, especially since the feeling is not simply prolonged from childhood days, but is permanently sustained by fear of the superior power of fate. I cannot think of any need of childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. Thus the part played by the oceanic feeling, which might seek something like the restoration of limitless narcissism, is ousted from a place in the foreground. Within human beings, especially in times of hardship and instability, there is a strong desire, not for revenge and chaos or for brutality and cruelty, but rather for a force of strength and power that will protect them and ensure justice. Not only in religion, but in the history of populism in the United States, one can see these desires being fulfilled. The greatest populist leaders in U.S. history have been those who pandered to the desires for strong, effective, compassionate leadership to protect the downtrodden. When the country was griped by divisions and economic strife created by the primitive, barbaric practice of chattel slavery, the first mass expression of opposition came in the form of a religious movement called the Second Great Awakening. Reverend Charles G. Finney and others convened tent revival meetings and great religious gatherings to denounce slavery, calling for the country to repent from the sinful practice. In the aftermath of this outpouring of religious opposition to slavery, political opposition to it soon emerged on the national stage with the rise of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a rural lawyer from the wild, newly settled territory of Illinois. He was 6 feet tall and had a booming voice. He condemned the rich and powerful with statements such as, "These capitalists generally act harmoniously and in concert to fleece the people, and now they have got into quarrel with themselves. They are called upon to appropriate the people's money to settle the quarrel. And it is the eternal struggle between those two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other is the divine right of kings. It is the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It is the same spirit that says, "You toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it." No matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle. Songs hailed this anti-slavery rabble-rouser, saying, "Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness." Another anthem widely sung by Lincoln supporters ended with the lines, "Success to the old-fashioned doctrine that men are created all free. Down with the power of the despot, wherever his stronghold may be." Lincoln was not Trump, a selfish bully displaying crass rudeness and indifferent to others. Lincoln was not Kamala Harris, seeking to unleash a torrent of destruction in vengeance for his own perceived victimhood. Lincoln was portrayed as a strong, powerful father figure, ready to beat back the forces of injustice and poverty and defend the helpless. Karl Marx spoke of him in similar tones, writing in 1864, "The working men of Europe feel sure that, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do the same for the working classes. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world." During the 1930s Depression, Huey Long ascended into the political leadership of Louisiana, first as governor and then as a U.S. Senator. Long built an organization across the United States called the Share Our Wealth Movement. Long taxed the oil refinery of the Rockefellers in Louisiana to bring a large amount of money into the state treasury. He used this money to build hospitals, fund literacy programs, construct bridges, and provide a large number of services for the people of Louisiana. The black community in particular gained due to Huey Long's efforts. Huey Newton, the founder of the Black Panther Party, was named by his parents in honor of Huey Long. Huey Newton's autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, described how Long enabled black women to become nurses and took other measures to help the black community, despite the atmosphere of Jim Crow racism. Long, like Lincoln, presented a personality of strength and compassion. Hailing his achievements for the people of Louisiana, he proclaimed, "We have opened up night schools to educate the adult illiterates. We have paved the highways. We have built free bridges. We have taken the insane out of the jail cells and placed them in modern institutions. We have eliminated barbarism. We have shut down the lottery. We have closed up the gambling dice. We have abolished the vice areas." Now the corporate element of this state and the cheap stooges who ransacked this state for their allies are being told what they can do and what they can't do, what they will pay and what they won't keep from paying. For the welfare of Louisiana, we expect to have this state ruled by the people, not by the lords and interest of high finance. Explain his vision for rescuing the country with the Share Our Wealth movement, he said, "Now, if you have on that table the food and the clothing and the products that it takes for 125 million people to live on, any man with a thimble full of sense ought to know that if you take 85% off that table and give it to one man, that you are bound to have 2/3 of the people starving because they haven't got enough to eat. How many men have ever wanted to barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon got to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the houses. Give 'em a yacht. Give 'em a palace. Send them to Reno and get them a new wife when they want it, if that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's loving earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat, and all their children's children can use, that's when we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here, put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. And that's the program. We're not going to destroy the Gulf Refining Company. We're not going to destroy the Standard Oil Company, but we're going to say that the limit of any one-man stock ownership in the Standard Oil Company is from $3 to $5 million for that individual, and that the balance of the people in America own the balance of what the Standard Oil Company's worth. We're going to say that every family in this country is entitled to the Florida and the Texas and the Louisiana homestead rights up to $5,000 or 1/3 of the average, a home, and the comforts of a home, including an automobile and the radio, the things that it takes in that house to live on. Roosevelt and the Popular Front. As Roosevelt faced opposition in 1936 and moved toward enacting progressive reforms such as the Works Progress Administration and eventually Social Security, he became more and more of a populist himself. The press told of a textile worker in South Carolina shaking Roosevelt's hand and proclaiming he was the first man in the White House to know my boss is a son of a bitch. Roosevelt delivered his 1936 speech in Madison Square Garden as he faced widespread opposition from the National Association of Manufacturers and the possible threat of a military coup by fascist sympathizers. These sympathizers had already attempted to do so with the business plot. Roosevelt lambasted his predecessors, proclaiming, "For 12 years this nation was afflicted with hear nothing, see nothing, do nothing government. The nation looked to government, but the government looked away. 9 mocking years with the golden calf, and 3 years of this Scrooge. 9 crazy years at the ticker, and 3 long years in the breadlines. 9 mad years of mirage, and 3 long years of despair. Powerful influences strive today to restore that kind of government with its doctrine that the government is best which is most indifferent." This notion of laissez-faire, free market, and utopian capitalism, long promoted by British bankers and predatory factory owners, was thoroughly rejected by Roosevelt. He knew his progressive reforms had faced widespread opposition from the ruling class. We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We now know the government organized by money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all of our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. Earl Bowder was the Communist Party presidential candidate in 1936. But he made very clear that his campaign was a struggle to defeat the Republicans. The question on the table was democracy or fascism, and Roosevelt's populist program of using the state to provide employment and build infrastructure while mobilizing organized labor was democracy. The plan of the factory owners for resolving the crisis with mass political repression, demonization of the Soviet Union, military spending, and concentration camp labor had to be defeated at all costs. Communist leaders like William Z. Forrester understood that a popular front against fascism needed to be formed. The Communist Party stood arm in arm with Roosevelt, a populist, against the Harrises and Trumps of the day and their own agenda of low wages, prisons, hostility towards Russia and China, and plans to deal with overpopulation by exterminating useless eaters. Following the 1936 election, Roosevelt defended the right of workers across the country to occupy their factories in the sit-down strike wave of 1936 and 1937. During the episode known as Labor's Gettysburg in Flint, Michigan, Roosevelt sent the military to defend the strikers from the local police and strike-breaking militias. The mass anti-communist hysteria of McCarthyism that set in following the Second World War and Roosevelt's death was necessary because a huge coalition had been built. Roosevelt, the Communist Party, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the Civil Rights Congress, American Youth for Democracy, and many other progressive, anti-fascist, and democratic networks existed, fighting for America's working families and calling for brotherhood and friendship with the people of the world. The specter of populism, genuine left-wing populism, not Trump's demagogy, now hangs over the United States. It is only a matter of time before movements fighting for the mobilization of state power to protect the suffering millions become bolder and stronger. Such a movement will not come from within the confused, distorted synthetic left any more than it will come from the racism and cruelty of the right. Such a movement can only flourish by going to the masses and addressing their real needs. A crisis at home and abroad. Who are the geopolitical rivals of the United States? Who are these authoritarian regimes the U.S. leaders impose sanctions on and condemn with such venomous contempt? In Latin America, they are the Bolivarians. They are socialists influenced by Marxism, Christianity, indigenous traditions, and the legacy of anti-colonialism in South and Central America. In Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and everywhere else, they have instituted public control over natural resources, built roads, wiped out illiteracy, and enabled millions to rise up from poverty. In China, it is a government that took what was once the sick man of Asia and made it into a superpower. The Chinese Communist Party has lifted more than 800 million people from poverty. It has sent spacecraft to the far side of the moon and has built Huawei, the largest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. With China's mass investment in fusion energy research, it threatens to render fossil fuels, an essential aspect of Wall Street and London's domination of the global market, to be obsolete. What Mao Zedong started with a peasant army in the mountains has shaken the world. The Chinese Communist Party's vision of reinventing the global economy on the basis of a win-win cooperation points towards a world without war and poverty and inspires people across the globe. The real achievements of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in terms of building schools, hospitals, and power plants in the developing world point to the promise being more than hollow words. The current leadership of Russia rescued the country from the disastrous results of the fall of the Soviet Union. This was done by placing oil and natural gas under public control and centralizing the economy around the state-controlled firms, not the anarchy of production. Russia continues to preside over poverty alleviation in the Far East and an explosion of the agricultural sector. Russia is cooperating with many African countries to help them expand their economies and continue on the road of poverty alleviation. The Eurasian Economic Union, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America all stand as contrary examples to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. The Bretton Woods institutions are committed to policies of deregulation and demolishing the economies of developing countries. While symbolic self-criticisms about being too neoliberal echo from the halls of Western global financial centers, these words are hollow bombast. These institutions, like almost all economic discourse in Western countries, is predicted on greed is good Adam Smith thinking. It is a belief that free trade and control of the global trade routes by Western financiers can somehow produce the ideal outcome from humanity. However, the built-in problem of the capitalist mode of production described by Karl Marx long ago has not gone away. The capitalist is constantly driving to produce more and more goods for as little cost as possible. The capitalist reduces the amount of labor involved in production, replacing it with machines, and creating a falling rate of profit. Machines do not create surplus value. Only human labor does. Machines replace workers on the assembly lines, increasing unemployment. The remaining workers' jobs become de-skilled by technology, and wages drop as a result. Soon the market is glutted with products that cannot be sold. As the capitalist works to increase profits, the worker is driven to produce harder and harder, but his ability to consume what he produces is constantly reduced. Soon the market is glutted with products that cannot be sold, the stock market crashes, an unnatural crisis that only takes place in the capitalist mode of production exists. Plenty creates poverty. Abundance leads to want. People become homeless because there are too many houses. People become hungry because there is too much food. Production organized for profit cannot escape this natural problem. The huge technological leaps brought about by the computer revolution have only exacerbated this problem. The only way out of this is for the banks, factories, and industries to be organized by state central planners and forced to work in the interests of society. Production for profit cannot continue. As millions are unemployed, hungry, and losing their homes amid the economic fallout of the pandemic, the words of Roosevelt about hear nothing, see nothing, do nothing government should be written in our ears. As millions suffer, even Bernie Sanders' minimal program of social democratic reforms couldn't be tolerated by the oligarchy of oil bankers, prison profiteers, weapons manufacturers, and Silicon Valley fascists who run the United States of America. Millions are now outcast and starving, watching their country crumble with unpaved roads, improperly purified water, and a failing systems of education and healthcare. Trump cannot liquidate this crisis. Kamala Harris will be equally impotent. As racist statues are torn down by liberal protesters and Trump's demagogy leads toward even greater instability, the longing of the part of much of the population isn't for violence and vengeance. There is a strong desire for that oceanic feeling of oneness, solidarity, and human life, the glue that holds civilizations together and enables whole societies to rise up from the ashes. There is a longing for leadership that is not cynical and bigoted or vengeful and destructive. There is a longing for a real government of action that can fight for those who are suffering, bring a divided country together, smash the rule of big bankers and profiteers, and completely reinvent the country. The ruling elite knows that the specter of populism, the specter of 21st century socialism, is hanging over their heads. It is not the specter of a foreign conspiracy or a demagogic politician, but the recognition that the people of the country will soon be rising in the millions to demand a society that puts their needs first.